everyone. I'm Darla Drew, president of Backroom Productions, and we're here for our second in a series of presentations called Writer's Block. And it's not about people that can't write because their brain is too congested. It's about people that have already are published, interested in publishing, and want to know more about the local book scene. We'll probably have people coming in and out as they talk, so if you're at home and you're watching this on Facebook and you see everybody look through at the door, that's all that's going on. There's no fire or anything like that. Just people coming in and out, because this is a pretty casual situation. We'd like to thank Arts Midwest for some of our funding, as well as the NEA and City of Rapid City, along with the Cave Collective. They've been so much help in getting this project started, and so cooperative with the older folks like myself who really don't know that much about technology, so we can get this thing on Facebook. So right now I'm joined by two local author photographers that launched a very special project about the 1972 flood. Before I introduce them anymore, let them talk about it, I will say that I was here for the 1972 flood. I was 16 years old. I was out watching a movie with some friends, trying to get rid of a blind date I had set up for that night. And we came out of the movie and it was just raining cats and dogs. So we tried to get anywhere we could to get home to. Our homes were mainly in the west part of Rapid City. We couldn't get anywhere. The police would turn us away, but we'd go, but we live over there. No, well, that's too bad. You can't go over there. You can't go over that bridge. You have to go somewhere else. And so we kept searching and luckily found a place to go in the Pinedale area, which is elevated, if you know Rapid City. We drove by Canyon Lake probably a few minutes before the dam broke, because the paddle boats were floating out into the road, and as kids are prone to be, we're like, oh wow, that's interesting, not knowing the danger that we were in. So when we did get somewhere, a wise mother said, you aren't leaving, you kids are not leaving, you're going into the basement, you're gonna stay here tonight. And it was the next morning when we realized actually that what we knew of most of our home was gone, and a lot of our neighborhood and a lot of our neighbors. My dad was in the National Guard, and he was in the communications system that night, and he was in charge of communications. What a place to be, huh? And so calls started coming in really quickly. And I knew something was going on, was really bad. And then the brass started showing up, and he's going, oh, I'm a major, and now generals are getting here, so this is really a big deal. And he was chief logistics officer. And they said, you've got to get this, get these guys from Lemon, get these guys from Obridge, everybody's got to come here that's not here already for the guard camp, because guard camp was going on. And then the general had a really unusual request of my father. He said, and I'm going to need 200 body bags by tomorrow morning. And that put my dad kind of out of shape. He knew how serious this was going to be. And he said, well, where the heck am I going to find 200 body bags? And he said, you're a logistics officer, it's up to you, better find them. So he flew them in. He worked with Ellsworth Air Force Base, and they flew them in, so they had them by the morning. But those are just some of the weird little stories. We're going to hear some really big stories from these guys. But no one that lived here was unscathed by this flood. And it changed my life. I was 16. I'd never seen adults not know what to do. I'd never seen everybody without answers. And so, yeah, it just changes your life when you have adults that not really sure what to do. I mean, they start cleaning up and they're going to take care of everything, but we've never quite seen anything like this. So these guys took this flood that happened 50 years ago and encapsulated some of the most memorable stories, I believe. And they've done a lot of other things on their way to writing this book. So where would you guys like to start? Would you like to start with this book or maybe some of your history?
Well, Seth has taught billing, so we'll let him kick it off.
Well, Seth, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself? A lot of people might not be familiar with what you've been doing and what you've been writing. I think you've written some really incredibly interesting things, especially the I would think Calvin Coolidge would be kind of boring, but I think you've probably found some cool things to write about him, so.
He is, to be fair. But can everybody hear me okay? So yeah, I grew up in Weston Springs and Kimball, South Dakota, which are, you know, small towns, less than 1,000 people, East River.
You might have to speak up.
Sorry, can you hear me? Good, okay. And so I went to college at South Dakota State University, got a journalism degree there, and I started a newspaper career where I started in Worthington, Minnesota, and just kept moving west. Was in Worthington, Minnesota first, and then Mitchell, South Dakota, and finally the Rapid City Journal, and wrote thousands of newspaper stories and had tons of great experiences and adventures there. And then in 2020, right before the pandemic, I moved to South Dakota Public Broadcasting, where I now work in the studio, Black Hill Studio, just right over here. And I do a lot of editing of radio scripts and web stories. I'm a supervising senior producer in the news division. And that's kind of what led me to, I guess for book-wise, I also wrote a book in 2017, as mentioned, about Calvin Coolidge. He was kind of a boring guy, but he did some exciting stuff in the Black Hills. In 1927, back then, presidents took the time to do a long summer vacation usually. This was pre-air conditioning, and they wanted to get out of Washington, D.C. and the muggy, hot capital there and all the mosquitoes in D.C., so they would go on a vacation. Well, Coolidge was the first president to go so far to decide that he wanted to come to South Dakota. And he actually lived here for 3 months in the Black Hills at Custer State Park. And he was present for the start of carving at Mount Rushmore. He announced in the old Rapid City High School that he was not going to seek re-election that year, which was a big shock to the country. He visited Pine Ridge, had all kinds of adventures. So I wrote a book about that in 2017. It was called Calvin Coolidge in the Black Hills. And then I also contributed to a Foder's travel guide on the Black Hills of South Dakota. And that kind of leads to this book. And Johnny,
I gotta stop you before you go away from
Sure.
Calvin Coolidge, okay? Is it true they called him Sleepy Cal because he slept every afternoon for like 3 or 4 hours?
Well, yeah, well, they called him Silent Cal
Okay.
because of how silent he was. But yes, his daily routine in Rapid City was he would, somebody would drive him from the game lodge at Custer State Park into Rapid City, where he had his office at the old Rapid City High School. He would spend the morning working. He would go back and he'd have lunch with his wife at the game lodge, and then he would take a nap, usually. And then they would, in the afternoon, he would fish or sightsee or whatever. But yeah, he was, he would work a few hours and nap a couple hours. And, yeah.
I wouldn't mind that. I think
Yeah.
we could have some presidents sleep a little bit more, and they couldn't do anything. They'd be asleep. So that would bother me a bit.
It was a slower pace of life.
It was a slower, more genteel kind of time, and I'm glad he came here. Did a lot of tourists follow his lead, you know, when they heard that he was coming out here to the Black Hills?
Absolutely. That's part of the book, and why I took it on was that, you know, he should and does get some, but maybe not as much as he should, get a lot of credit for putting the Black Hills on the map as a tourist destination. In the 20s, automobile tourism was in its infancy, and he spent 3 months out here, and every day for 3 months, there was a dateline in the New York Times and all the papers all across the country from Rapid City about what he was doing here, and they ran pictures of the Black Hills and really popularized this place as a tourist destination.
I'm trying to think of my history here, but sorry. Did Rushmore, did the Shrine of Democracy, whatever, get sculpted after he was here, before he was here?
They were trying to start carving him, and that was part of recruiting him here. Was Peter Norbeck, who was a senator at the time, thought it'd be great for the fundraising if we could get the president here and sort of raise money for Rushmore around his presence, and they did. So when Coolidge was present for the dedication ceremony, where they actually took the first drill bit to Mount Rushmore and started the drilling.
Wow.
And then when he got back to Washington, he signed a bill that dedicated the first federal funds for Mount Rushmore, and really kind of set it on its way.
Big part of history.
Yeah.
Well, then you were in Fodor's, travel guide, which is a big deal. And then you said that was going to lead you to talking to how you started working with Johnny and some of the work you guys have done together on that before we get to your latest project.
Yeah, and Johnny can fill you in on that because he really started this by calling me with the idea.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, there's some famous people out there in the crowds. Pat Roseland, running for city council, head of the Minnelusa, and Bill Evans on the city council. And we met a professor from Crazy Horse School with a PhD. That was exciting, and a writer for a motor type magazines, freelance writer, and well, our great friend Kenny Putnam back there from Hee Haw and Roy Clark fame. Lest you not know him, say hi. Kenny got us hooked up with Darla. So anyway, my name is Johnny Sundby. I am also an ex-photojournalist, and I had a 6-year stint with the Rapid City Journal in the early 1990s. My time didn't quite overlap with Seth's, but I love history, and I had read his Coolidge book. And my sister is also a journalist in Helena, Montana, and she and I were always going to write this book. She came back for the summers generally, and just pretty much got too busy with kids and teaching and so on. And I said, Jill, it's time to do it. We only got a year before the 50th anniversary. And she said, I got to decline. And I said, well, I'm going to ask someone else. And she said, that's totally fine. So Seth was absolutely first choice. And I called him and said, hey, Seth, let's meet. I got a great idea for us. We're going to make another coffee table book. This is my 4th book. I'll tell you some more about the other 3 in a second. But we'll try to speak about this project specifically tonight. Seth and I met, and I kind of laid out our plan and a business plan of sorts, and he said, sure, that would be great. And he can tell you, too, that it fit in with his South Dakota Public Broadcasting reporting duties as well. So what we did, if you want to flip through a few of those slides here, that'd be good. What we did was, you can just keep going for about 25 of them as I'm talking, I think. What we did was we rounded up 27 people with stories, and people always ask us if we were declined, and we were declined for about three times. But it was really quite easy to find flood survival stories. There must be 3,000 of them, I'm thinking, or I don't know, at least 1,000, it's hard to say. But everyone that we talked to had another story or another person to tell us about. And so what we did was we interviewed them for an hour or 2, and we photographed them, generally in the places where their story occurred. I did the photography work. I'm a full-time professional photographer. Seth did the interviews and the writing, and we put it all together with a local designer and had the book published overseas. And we tried to really hustle the project, not in a way I don't think that hurt the book at all, but we knew the 50th was coming up, and we just got the book back about 10 days ago, so we really did just get in the nick of time. We've sold almost 300 books in about 12 days, so it's been amazing, really. We sell them besides SethTupper.com or my photo studio at Mitzi's and BAM, and Alex Mercantile, Leathered Vein, Boys Drug, Mount Rushmore Society, a few others I'll think of soon. The stories, Seth's going to say something different than I, but as newspaper people, we had to write under the gun all the time. When I was a newspaper photographer, we would do as many as 4 or 5 photo shoots in a day, and they were due by 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, whatever it was. And so the shooting wasn't really the hard part, but the writing. Seth is a tremendously great writer and a real perfectionist, and I think that it was harder for him. He can talk about that a little bit. We kind of put him under the gun a little bit with another full-time job at the same time, and a wife and a couple kids at home, so thank you for your patience. So you can talk.
I'd like to just jump in here with you, Johnny, on some of this stuff. You do have the other books that you said you would talk about, which will be great. About this project, though, for both of you, what did you find exhilarated you and what exhausted you about doing this project?
Well, what exhilarated me, I mean, I love history, I always have. and I think it's important to preserve it. And Johnny mentioned Pat Roseland here. I should mention Pat was kind enough, he's a collector of a lot of great local historical material. He gave me a bunch of the photos that I used in my Coolidge book that he had collected over the years. I just think it's really important to preserve history. And so, you know, the idea to me immediately, what appealed to me was, yeah, the people that survived the flood won't be around forever. You know, when the 75th and the 100th come around, the stories that we haven't recorded or written down will be gone. And
yeah.
So that really was the draw for me, was to get out and preserve these stories, because I think a lot of survivors will tell you that you know, we need to know what people went through, so we know why it's so important to have a good floodplain policy. And so yeah, that was, and what exhausted me was just the process of doing it. You know, obviously, you know, we knew we had to get this book out before June 9th this year, and so we really hustled it. It was a credit to Johnny booking all these people and lining them up, and we'd show up and we'd do the photo shoot, and I would do the interview right there on the scene, usually where their story happened, and we really pushed it to get the book done. And it was, and then the other part that exhausted me was just knowing how important these stories are to the people in the community. There's a lot of pressure to get it right and to get it correct and to get it accurate, and so
yeah.
that was stressful. But you know, it's such a worthy project that it was worthwhile for sure.
How about you, Johnny? Anything that exhilarated you or exhausted you the most about this project?
I found it quite exhilarating rather than exhausting, really, because I'm a journalist by trade, but I've been self-employed for the last 20-some years, after 7 years of journalism and photojournalism. So for me, it was a blast, really. It made me feel like I was a newspaper photographer again, rather than shooting soccer kids and high school seniors and stuff. So it was really a blast. And like Seth says, you know, people are forgetting the flood, and there's so many bends in the creek that have tremendous stories that I like you, grew up here. I was 5 years old the night of the flood, and I've photographed all along this creek for the last 30 years almost, and I look at every bend in the river differently now than I did before. Places like Magic Canyon and the dog park and Cliffside Park, these stories are unbelievable. And right below the dam, of course, was just horrible. And it really makes you respect the city, the floodplain laws. Thank you, Darla. It makes you respect nature. I think that people need to read the book. This is one of the worst disasters in the United States. I mean, next to the Galveston flooding, I think it is. It's one of the worst things that's happened as far as deaths from a natural event, and people don't always realize that from Rapid City because it's too close. You don't really see what's so close. So I would say that.
I want to just jump off something you've said too, as far as preserving the floodplain. It is an ongoing exercise for the city, because there's always people that see that lovely virgin land and they just want to build on it, and oh, why don't we put homes down there, and why don't we do this, or you could at least make more soccer fields or whatever. And Bill and I know, and he was here for the flood, that we always have to be protecting it. You know, when I look at some of the trees down there, I can still see some of the indentations when they were hit by houses or cars, or I see flowers that don't belong on that part of the creek, and I go, that was somebody's yard. And so for us, it's a different experience if you grow up here, because you knew they were neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. They were all neighborhoods, and now they're this beautiful greenway that is completely unnatural to the development of the city, because it goes through our entire midsection. So yeah, people like myself, who is looking at this 50-year anniversary that you guys are so wise to put this together. We need this. We need to be reminded that, although I don't know that it could happen again with the severity it had, because we put so many things in place, like we built Canyon Lake, we have better siren systems, we had no, alarm systems at 12 o'clock at night on the night of the flood. All those things where it can spread out now, the water can spread out, gets sunk into the soil. All those things we put in place, we cannot encroach on those, or we'll be back in the same boat. And that's a terrible pun, but we would be back in the same place if it were not for people on the council, or a very visionary council after the flood, that put these things in place. They brought in Japanese planners, they put in the bike paths and all those things. It was just really well done.
Yeah, I just saw Dave's picture up here, and maybe Seth can tell you his story just in a nutshell here, and I'll tell you one more after that, just to get a feel more specifically what we reported on.
Yeah, well, Dave Baumberger was one of the survivors we interviewed, and he was a young man then, 1972, newly married, but his parents had just bought a home right beside the creek, right above Canyon Lake, where I guess it's called Lions Park now, where there's a trail right above Canyon Lake. And that was a neighborhood back then, and his parents bought that house thinking it would be their retirement home and they would live out their lives there. Night of the flood, his dad asked Dave to go down there and help him move some items out of the house, because they just thought it's going to be some high water, we'll just move some items out of the house. And so he went to do that, and the water came up so fast that they left that house and went to another house in the same neighborhood that was a little higher up. And pretty soon there were 9 people together in that home from that neighborhood, and the water just kept coming up, as he said, in 3 or 4 foot increments, at a time, just unbelievably fast. And he said when the refrigerator started to float in the kitchen, they retreated upstairs into the attic, and then the house started to move and shake and break off its foundation, and the roof broke apart. And Dave said that he escaped through the rupture in the roof, and everything was so chaotic, he had no idea what happened with the other 9 people in the house at that instant. But he then was out in Canyon Lake, because the house was so close, and he started swimming for the shore, and he felt the dam break. He said he was near the shore, and the water just started pulling everything toward the spillway, and he was actually flushed down through the spillway a couple miles and ended up all the way down by Osham and Schmidt Funeral Home, where somebody was able to grab him and pull him out into a pickup. And he found out later that he and a young boy were the only 2 people of the 9 who lived that night from that house. So, and that's what, when I say, when you hear these stories, boy, you certainly understand how important it is to protect the floodplain. And I've had some people ask, why are we dredging this up again? Why would people want to go through this pain again and hear these stories? And I respect that viewpoint, but I also think you don't really understand how important the policies are in the floodplain until you hear a story as painful as the story, and then, boy, do you understand it then,
If you can you go back one slide, backwards? Or maybe 2. Okay, this is Dick Connect, and some of you probably know Dick Connect. He's really a rock star back in the day. He was an architect, and in Cliffside Park, which, by the way, needs a sign because nobody knows where Cliffside Park is unless you're on Google Maps, but you go past the dog park, it's on the right-hand side. It's the only place where the creek is actually on the right-hand side of the highway as you're going up 44 west. Anyway, that was Cliffside Park, and if you see here, there's a couple of condos that were moved out of Cliffside Park after the flood, and there were, I think, 12 or 15 of those that Dick Connect had just finished building. He was a 28-year-old architect and developer at the time, and the willow tree that you still see in Cliffside Park, he looked at it and he was just smiling, and I go, what's up with the willow tree? And he said, well, we had quite the argument about whether they were allowed to plant that willow tree here in front of our condos because it was supposed to be native trees. And he looked at it and said, man, sure is beautiful. And so this wall here that he's posing on was built by just one of the homeowners who had the first condo on the upstream side to try to divert the water. But this condo facility, maybe some of the older people in here even remember that, but it had a swimming pool and a circular driveway and just beautiful condos all along the creek. Well, needless to say, the other side of the creek was a sheer wall, so that water didn't have any place to go except right through these condos. And so Dick came down. He knew there was going to be a problem with how much rain we were getting, so he came down at night to warn the people living there and said, "You got to get out of here. This is not good." And he got trapped in one of the condos, and they spent the night upstairs. And he said they rescued one girl out of the creek who had all of her clothes basically torn off from the river, and spent the night there. And they survived well enough, but his whole place was destroyed. And he said he lost $1 million overnight. He said, and he moved to Aspen, Colorado, and became an architect for most of his career, including designing a house for John Denver and Annie Denver at the time. But that was one of those stories. And I've been to Cliffside Park 100 times, as maybe you guys have too, and nobody knows what was there. And these condos are at the mouth of Dark Canyon now, and I think Sheila Tom lives in one of them, or she used to anyway. And they're still there, but they're left over from Dick's. Okay.
I'm going to leave you guys to your presentation now, because I think that, you might want to work in a little bit more about your process or whatever it is. I know you have things lined up you want to talk about. But I do want to say, with this book, the reactions are going to be different. I was going through a store. I was going through Weather Vane with my friend, and I said, "Oh, look, there's the flood book," and I picked up a copy and looked at it. She took a copy, looked at 2 pages, burst out in tears, and walked away.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I mean, that's the kind of reactions you think you'll see, and they'll be very, very different. To me, I wanted to see it. She said, I just can't. So for some folks that were there, it's still too raw, So, okay, so I'm gonna go. I'll probably go get you some water, and then you guys can just take it from here.
Thank you. So, let's see. All 4 of my books are self-published, and there's different ways to publish, I'm sure. And for me, it was always better just to self-publish. And some of them have done tremendously well. My In God's Country book, Photographs of the Black Hills and Badlands, has surpassed 44,000 copies sold just regionally. So I'm super happy about that. I made that with my dad in 1995. Originally through Rushmore Photo and Gifts. They published it first for the first couple of years, and then they just decided they didn't want to do it anymore. And so we took over. The second book I did was in 2004. It was on the Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains. And it's called Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains, like no place on earth. It's just all photos of the wilderness and the cowboys and some of the towns. And it was a lot of fun to do. I spent about 5 years shooting photos for that, and several times a year I would go out there and travel. And then the third book was called Deadwood Town of Legends, which I was shooting photos for the Deadwood Chamber of Commerce anyway, so I had a lot of photos of the events going on in Deadwood, shooting for George Milos at the time. And the Deadwood HBO series came out that year, and so we're like, whoa, we should do a book, because everybody's loving Deadwood right now. And that book, even though it's one of the nicest books that I've done, has sold the least. We've struggled to get rid of the first printing, which I think was about 3,000 copies, and we still have a couple of cases left, maybe 180 or 100 books or something. But as far as publishing goes, self-publishing, you're the guy paying for the book, you're the guy trying to distribute the book, you're the guy creating the book. And for me, it's a good idea because my books were so localized anyway. But if the subject matter, like Coolidge or whatever, is a nationwide book, like Alaska, stories like we were talking with you earlier, that maybe isn't the best plan because you'd want to have a bigger market. So, and I don't know too much about trying to publish with someone else, how that works. Seth may have more to say about that.
Yeah, I would just open it up for questions, probably, if in the interest of keeping it cash, as we said. If anybody's got any questions, I'd love to have a conversation about this book or
I've got a ton
writing
of
or anything.
questions. You
So-
want me to come back up there?
Sure,
and question you?
Does anybody have any questions from the crowd? I know you're all writers, and it's an honor
Yeah.
to be here speaking to all of you. You probably know plenty about stuff.
So, how do you approach your writing process? You know, we do have writers here. And so when you go to approach something, you just do all your research and then start, or you do little bits at a time, or how do you sew your story together?
Well, it depends on the project, but for this one, of course, it starts with research. Before we did any interviews, of course, I was familiar with a lot of flood history just from living here and working for the newspaper and everything. But yeah, I looked up all the reports from the U.S. Geological Survey and all the different federal agencies and School of Mines and the cloud seeding stuff and all that
Do
stuff.
you guys know about
So-
the cloud seeding stories? I only see a few people shaking their heads. Maybe you'd like to elaborate on that.
Well, yeah, just briefly. There was a School of Mines was doing cloud seeding experiments that spring, where they would go up in a plane and they would basically dump powdered salt into clouds in this experiment to try to add particles into the clouds that they could get condensation on and increase the amount of rainfall. And they actually flew 2 flights the day of the flood, and that was very controversial. There were a lot of reviews and scientific reviews, and there was litigation, and the official line was that it didn't cause or increase the severity of the flood. But of course, some of the people we interviewed, you won't ever convince them that wasn't a factor. It was very controversial. So that was the process. Was I tried to ground myself in all of that stuff and everything I could read about the flood, so that when people were talking about things that happened, or were talking about cloud seeding, or were talking about places and times and events, I'd have some knowledge of that already. And then I think the rest of the process, I'm big on organization. We did the interviews. We'd go out, and of course I took video and audio of all the interviews. I guess that'd be good to mention too for South Dakota Public Broadcasting. We'll have an episodic podcast coming out starting next week from the interviews. We have a television documentary that'll be screened June 8th at The Journey, and it'll be on TV June 9th on SDPB.
Excuse me, that's just going to be like a film of the film, or can you tell me exactly what that means?
Yeah, it's called Surviving the 72 Flood as well. And so what we did is we basically moved west to east through the city. We took these stories. We didn't get to use all the stories from the book because it's an hour documentary. We had to limit it to something. But we basically progress west to east down the creek and tell these people's stories sort of in real time and mix it with photographs and historic video. Some video that Pat Roseland shot, actually, that's now in the Minnelusa, at the Journey Museum with the Minnelusa Historical Association. And so, anyway, but yeah, we captured video and audio of all the interviews. So what I would do then is I would go back, I ran them, all the interviews through a transcript service, and before I would write the stories, I would re-listen to every interview again, and I would, with the transcript, and highlight parts of the stories that I wanted to bring out and highlight and tell. And then I would start writing and write the story. All of them are roughly the same length. I think they're 800 to 1,000 words.
You really condense them so well. I can tell your editing prowess there, because it is, these are big stories.
Mm-hmm.
They could go on for pages. So, to condense them like that and to get the essence of the story is really important. Now, when you were taking people's pictures, what were you really trying to catch with their look, Johnny? When you see them, they're in an area that changed their lives. So what are you trying to pull out of them in a picture?
The main thing, I guess, is just trying to light them and pose them well, like I do in my photo studio. And we kind of decided early on we didn't really necessarily want people smiling. There were one or two that just needed to be smiling, I think, but for the most part, we wanted them to be a little more somber, because the interviews were extremely somber, telling stories of losing their wife or losing their children or whatever it was hard. And tears running down my face at least once or twice. And if you flip through a couple more slides, we'll show you kind of how we did it. And I should point out too that Seth did double duty in a way. And we didn't always go together. Maybe half the time we were together, half the time we were apart. But when we worked together, I would shoot for a while, and then Seth would interview for a while and use his cell phone to record, being the excellent journalist that he is. But those videos also turned out to be the fodder for the broadcasting shows too. So
Sure.
In retrospect, we needed to light them a little better, but
Yeah. Well, the other part of the process, since you mentioned that, was interviewing a lot of these people where their story happened was really crucial to it too, because I told Johnny early that I wanted to go on his photo shoots as much as I could with these people, because I thought it's one thing interviewing somebody at our studio or something, it's another thing to interview them where their story happened, where they're pointing to this and that and remembering, and they're getting visual cues from the scene that caused them. And that was really fascinating to interview people in that way, because they were really reliving the story, I think, as they were telling it, because they were in that
you
place.
can keep going, Dexter, there. And, just keep on going. There's some shots of us putting the book together too that are following, and some historical photos. We used some historical photos, but very little. I mean, the Journal did a great job using historical photos, and Don Barnett has a book out, of course, you guys probably know too. And the Masters have an amazing book about losing their 3 kids, and have sold over like 130,000 copies, they told us, and it's just unbelievable. They spent 10 years traveling and telling about how to deal with grief and how to get over that. Ron Masters is a Baptist preacher, and I mean, you can't think of something more difficult. But they found some solace in helping other people deal with grief, and spent a whole decade of their lives traveling and selling their books, you know, as an aside to that. I don't think that was their main focus. I think it was just self-healing, really, more than anything. And they're amazing people.
I've got a question
keep going, Dexter.
I've got a question from the audience. Patty, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, this might kind of an interesting question. Do either one of you consider yourself historians through your work? History through photography and history through like broadcasting? I kind of interesting your thoughts about considering yourself a historian through your
I'm going to repeat the question so we make sure it goes through the audio feed. Do you consider yourself photo historians or writing historians, and how do you see yourself in this process?
I think Seth may say the same thing, but I consider myself a journalist or a photojournalist, and in a way that's the same thing. It's just that you're writing about things that are much more recent in history, like today or yesterday, you know, for the most part. But the thing that journalists and historians have in common is they're correct, they're factual, they've been verified, they're unbiased, and they're telling. Journalism is extremely important. I think everyone in this room probably agrees with that. That's one of the main things that keeps America great, and honest, and not being completely one-sided, you know, by what the government says is happening. And you just look to Russia to see the opposite right now. So I would say I love history. If I had life to do over again, I might like to be a history professor rather than a photographer and a journalist. But that's my answer.
I would say, yeah, I'm not a credentialed historian, so I don't claim to be one. The same thing. I approach. My training is in journalism, so I consider myself a journalist and a storyteller, and we set out to try to tell these stories, you know, to be a conduit for these people's stories, and we didn't try to set out to write a definitive book on the flood that also explained the science of how much rain fell, or answer the cloud seeding question definitively or anything like that. Like a 300-page book, authoritative history of the flood might do. We set out to tell these people's stories as journalists and storytellers, basically. That's the approach. And, that is, we're preserving their stories for history, and it wouldn't surprise me if, some historian uses them in some other book about the flood, but we were really approached it as storytellers. So.
As a person that saw those clouds, and there's probably a couple more in here that saw those clouds, never have I seen clouds like that before. That green, that dark, that threatening. And I went through the 62 flood as well. That was 10 years prior, and they had dark regular clouds. As I recall, I was a kid, I was probably 5 or something. But I went through that one too. And so we did have those cyclical floods until we had the big one. So we took all these this information and actually changed our city and the way that the topography was and the way the water ran, as you guys are probably going to talk about a little bit. So when you're putting together this book, how you said you went west to east, and did you find that the stories were less? I've always wondered, like, how, as people went east, was it getting better, and the stories were not as impactful, or not as, that's wrong, not as tragic?
No, unfortunately, it was equally tragic. I mean, I actually, we mapped all this out for the documentary, and it was, I don't know if you did that by design when you were contacting people, but we got a really good cross-section of people from west to east, from Magic Canyon all the way to east of what today would be the monument, And, but yeah, all along that section, it was not any more or less tragic, it was just different, as we talked to people who were above Canyon Lake, who, one of the strange things was when the water was rising there and they were really struggling and in terrible danger, then the dam broke, and then it changed for people downstream, and all of a sudden the water receded above the lake.
That was something I didn't know until we started talking to people, but there was many deaths upstream from the dam. This isn't all about the dam breaking. That was a big part of a lot of problems and a lot of death, but it was definitely not the big part of it. And what happened was the Rapid Canyon is so narrow that the dam actually kind of contributed to some of the flooding at first. The water just kept going back up. Rob Corner said Magic Canyon looked like the Missouri River coming through there. I mean, if you know where that road is and through Magic Canyon, that was 8 feet underwater or 5 feet underwater or something like that.
I think it's about 8 when you see where you saw the marks were on those trees.
And some of these people said that when the dam broke was actually when the people upstream got to climb out of the trees and find some refuge, which I had really no idea about that. So it isn't just about the dam breaking. Is one thing that I learned.
Do we have any more questions out there? Which you're like,
There's just one more.
Has another?
Did you find that the photos or the words struck you more as far as evoking the tragedy itself, or did they strike you in different ways? I mean, pictures worth 1,000 words, but words are very important in describing their own experiences. Like that photo, I'm not sure how you would describe that photo. I guess is that a powerful thing itself, or was the story itself that accompanied it?
I think for
Excuse
sure.
me, I gotta just say it again,
sorry.
just for the people that might be watching on Facebook or wherever, or see this on YouTube. She wants to know if the photos, the actual photos, were more impactful. The genuine photos taken the days after or the day after the flood were more impactful to you. How you felt about seeing those?
I think we'll both answer, but my answer is definitely the stories, because you hadn't heard them before, most of them. I mean, some you had maybe, but for the most part, people have kept these to themselves until they talk to us. And the writing is tremendous. It's just accurate. It's not fluff. It's not too long. It's not too short. It's just the story. And all of us probably have seen those day after photos. In fact, probably all over the place. And we didn't want a book of that. The photos that you're seeing here, by the way, that's one of my dad's photos that he took on June 10th. And we had a few of his in there. But they're all run postage stamp size, really. The portraits, as you saw in the layout, that's what we were after. That's what took up 1 page out of 2 throughout the whole book. And so I would say definitely the words.
Well, what I liked about the approach that Johnny took was, as he said, we've all seen the damage photos, and that's kind of people's image of the flood is all those damage photos. The idea of doing portraits of survivors really appealed to me because it puts a face on all this, and these were people that were trapped in the water, and that had the survivors had to carry on and pick up and move on with their lives and carry some of this pain with them for the rest of their life, and I just thought it was an interesting, different approach to look at the people instead of necessarily the damage photos that we've all seen. So I thought it was really interesting to do that.
We've got another question here, and I will repeat it after you say it.
Did you have to get model releases and so forth for everybody to sign?
Did you have to get model releases for all the people that you took pictures of? I'm sure there were already releases for all the archive footage, but the ones that you were working with?
We were more concerned about those journalistic shots, not my portraits per se. So we didn't use any Rapid City Journal photos, for example, for 2 reasons. Number one, they had a competing book and they didn't want us to. But number two, they had a competing book and we didn't want to. So we got photos from the National Guard. We got photos from the families themselves that we interviewed. We got photos from my dad's collection. We got photos from Dr. Keith Johnson, who's a veterinarian that was one of the subjects in the books, who also was an amateur photographer and had some really nice stuff. He helped us so much that we gave him some credit on the inside cover even. But as far as the portraits go, it would probably be a good idea to have them sign, but I think it's pretty obvious what we're doing, and they're spending over an hour with us getting photographed and maybe another hour getting interviewed, and it was very clear that we were making a book, and I'm not even 1% worried that somebody's gonna sue us for being in the book, given the circumstances of the people who didn't want to be in the book just said no. We didn't chase them down or anything else. We just let them go. So.
Seth, anything to add?
No, not on that front. One thing I did want to add in the process was, I need to say, the last part of my process was having my wife edit all the stories for me. So, yeah, she was my one of my main editors on this. And then we also, Johnny saw all the stories obviously before they published it, and we took the step, which I would never do as a journalist writing for a paper, but we actually had every subject read their story here because of, again, really in this project, we felt like we were just the conduit for it was their story. We wanted to make sure it was told in the way that they wanted, and that everything was accurate and everything. So we did actually have everybody.
Normally you wouldn't do that for a newspaper story. So I called Seth one day and said, hey, one guy wants to read a story. How do you feel about that? And Seth didn't think too long about it, and he said, you know what, I think that's a good idea because we want it to be right. And I think also we don't want one person to say we said something that they didn't say, because it's not exactly a newspaper, it's a book. So.
Well, I have kind of a question that's a little bit off-center, I think. But for those of us that were here, or those of you that read about this flood, we had some pretty miraculous things happen. Although this flood was tremendously damaging and took so many lives, we had some things in place that I don't know how it happened. We had the National Guard that were here, were having their Golden Coyote exercises. People from all over the state that were the Guard were here. Most of them were deployed to Badlands at that point, so we had to get them back in. The Guard were in different units at that point. We had more of them, brought them in. And just a story I learned this afternoon, there was a morticians conference in Keystone, and they had the Red Cross there with a big semi full of their latest stuff. And so we had all the things that were in that semi, and then we needed morticians here as well, and a lot of them. What do you have to say about that, Kenny?
Well, not about morticians, but there was a podcast in Germany band festival here too, and we were hosting brothers and their father from Bad Gassen, Germany, and we were going to go up to Jenny Gulch that night, and you know, he, being one parent, my parents said no way, and then we just tried to get my mom to the journal the next morning to be at the journal, and we couldn't get there.
That was Kenny Putnam telling a story about some students from a band concert that was that weekend. I didn't get to catch. They were German students, German band students, and they were going to go up to Jenny Gulch. There were a lot of us out there really doing stupid things that night, Kenny. I was trying to get into Dark Canyon because we going, hey man, we live up there. We didn't. We heard there were some friends up there, and so there was a lot of just angels that night, I think, for some people, and then some just unusual happenings. And did you hear about those kinds of things? Did you hear like, hey, the guard was there, they took care of me, or any of that stuff?
Yeah, well, one thing, you know, Don Barnett, who was mayor at the time, there was a death and dying conference that morning in Rapid City that brought lots of different kinds of people, but clergy people and medical people, and to talk about, you know, helping a community deal with a mass death event, which is kind of crazy. But that was, yeah, the mayor attended that event that morning in Rapid City and said he was there with somebody who said, well, we'll never have to worry about this in Rapid City, you know, something like this happening. And Sharon Weber, that was a nurse that we interviewed, and she told us that at one of the hospitals, they had just done a training the week before on like a mass casualty scenario. They'd updated their training, and so they'd all just had this training a week before. And as you mentioned, there were 2,000 National Guard soldiers either between the Badlands and Camp Rapid here that were just happened to be here for their annual training. And then many of those Guards soldiers saved lives that
and
day.
Lost lives. They lost their lives too.
And were instantly deployed, and just because they just happened to be here for their training. So it was a lot of strange coincidences.
There were.
Three of our stories were National Guard rescue stories. And one guy, the Alex Johnson guy there, he couldn't come up with a number, but in excess of 50 or 60 people, he and his buddies drove from Memorial Park to the Alex, a big truck with a winch and all that stuff, and driving right into the river. And super humble guy, and that's why we wanted to photograph him in that Alex lobby, because that's where all those people were taken at that time, and it fit his story really well. And the helicopter pilot in there, we put his Huey in there as well, because he spent a week flying rescue missions after the flood. But before he could ever get in his helicopter, he was up on Highway 44 and told to go down into Magic Canyon, which at the time, by the way, was called Rapid Canyon. There was no Magic Canyon or Dark Canyon names at this time. And he ended up in a tree after trying to rescue. He did rescue a pregnant lady. He said, got her back up to Highway 44, went back to get her husband, and they both kind of got stuck down in the river bottom. And so anyway, Duke Doring helped us with some of those, hooking up with some of the National Guard people, and also gave us permission to use those National Guard photos too. By the way, I'm standing up because I got a little bit of a bad back and I can't sit that long. It makes my leg fall asleep. So.
We've got another question out there though, ma'am. Would you like to stand up and ask your question? And then I will repeat it.
During this whole process, I'm sure you had many amazing moments and experts, but was there a moment that was your favorite or something that took you most by surprise?
What an excellent question. She just asked if during this process there was a moment that took you by surprise or just really affected you a great deal, or maybe touched you more than you thought it would.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the most probably affecting moment, we're interviewing a woman named Kay Schriever, and she had been in a car. There were 6 teenagers in one car, and when the water rose, they pulled over into the Rushmore building on West Main, and the water was coming up fast, and she took off and ran for a fire escape and got up on it, but the other ones didn't, and she saw 2 of her friends washed away in the high water right there, and she ended up having to go identify the body of her best friend, basically. And being there where it had happened, you know, it was emotional for her as though it happened, you know, yesterday. And yeah, that was you know, just people went through just incredibly terrible, painful things, and she mentioned that, you know, everybody should have been in counseling, but this was 50 years ago, and we didn't do that, and it really drove home for me, you know, what people have had to carry, you know, for 50 years, what they went through and the things they saw, and how painful it really was for people.
That story keeps unfolding for us even today. We got an email. Well, first of all, Kay Shriver was with a guy named Mike Faust, who they had just met on Mount Rushmore Road cruising like we did back in those days. And they didn't know each other well, but they were all mutual friends in this car. And Mike Faust had a pretty cool car, I forget what it was, some kind of a sports car, and he had just graduated from high school. So he, in this parking lot, they actually drove down there to look at the flooding, of all things. And the water kind of started sneaking up on the parking lot, and Kay just, this was amazing to me too, she instinctually said, "I'm out of here," and she ran across the parking lot, knee-deep water, to the fire escape when her 4 friends didn't think that was necessary, and she got out just high and dry. It was a brilliant thing. That was just a complete stroke of instinct and luck, and people that turned right instead of left got killed, and people that went right, you know, just don't even hardly have a flood story. And the randomness of it all was really striking to me. But what I was getting at too was Mike Faust's story is also in there, and Seth did an amazing, I was on my phone trying to find that audio, really. I wasn't just checking my phone, but Seth had those 2 stories intertwined and going back and forth, and he told the whole story of that car that night, but from 2 different people, interviewed on 2 different days. And that was, like you're asking, that was super powerful to me, how much they are exactly the same story from 2 different people, 2 different interviews, and how he seamed them together. And I think that's part of the broadcasting
Part
show.
of the documentary, yeah.
So yeah, June 8th and June 9th, you'll get a chance to see that on TV. But somebody bought one of our books, because they wrote a story about our book in South Dakota Magazine, and a lady bought the book from Rapid who lives in California. And she said, "I think that I rescued one of these guys from this car. Can you get me in touch with Kay Shriver or Mike Faust?" And so we did, you know, actually. And Mike and she talked today for an hour on the phone, and pretty cool. And she told him all about his friend, you know, rescuing him and pulling him out of the river, and stuff that he didn't know until today, really, from our book. And that was pretty cool to me to see that. So there were a lot of moments though that I think were interesting and moving in the book.
Well, we're just going to jump back to your talent for just a moment before we wrap up here. You know, we do have writers here tonight. We will have next month, on June 16th, we're at 7 p.m. We're hoping that, well, we're not hoping, they'll be here. Bruce Junick and Taz Thacker. They're going to talk about their adventure books as they bicycled all over the world, from China through the Central America, South America, Africa, Russia, all over the world. And they did that for a while and took a lot of pictures and wrote some books about that. And then now Bruce Junick, while he was riding on his bike, came up with a series of books, the Bright One Chronicles, which is a fantasy series, and he'll be talking about that. And that will be on June 16th at 7 p.m. And once again, this series is brought to you by Backroom Productions with help from the Cave Collective. And as we get ready to close this session, do you have any advice for the writers out there that you use that got you more invigorated to get published, or how you got this road where you are kind of the success stories here? You know, you're working on all these things with South Dakota Public Television. You've got several books And what's some advice? Just a few words.
I guess I would say I really believe in manufactured luck, and what I mean by that is just, you know, I worked really hard in newspapers for 20 years and just cranking out stories day after day after day, you know, and it could be a real grind sometimes.
Yeah.
But had a ton of great mentors who taught me a lot about writing, and you know, over time people would notice your stuff and start to like it or whatever, and it was all that work for 20 years in newspapers that you know, made Johnny notice stories I wrote in the journal, and you know, to think that he might want to collaborate with me on this and those kinds of things. And so you know, sometimes I've gotten opportunities like that that are luck, but they're luck that resulted from, you know, 20 years of hard labor, you know, in advance.
That
and somebody
is.
noticed something. So,
You want to be a writer,
so
you
that'd be
gotta
my
write.
advice is just, you know, work real hard at it and try to put yourself out there, and somebody will notice it, and that will lead to something else, and then you never know where you're gonna end up with it. So
I think too is, I do the books, it's a tiny percent of what my photo studio is about, but it's the most fun part. You know, I do it for my own enjoyment and my own satisfaction, and just to be a journalist again instead of a portrait photographer, and I really enjoy that. And my advice is actually not to put all your eggs in that writing basket, but make it kind of a hobby, and it kind of applies to music in a way, and Kenny could probably talk about this as a Darla played music for years and stuff, and if you have to rely on it solely, your love can kind of ruin you in a way too, I think, sometimes, because it's no fun anymore. So for me, I do it as this, you know, I push aside the mundane jobs that I'm doing day after day after day, year after year, to do this project, and it's great fun, and it invigorates me and wants me to do more books. And but it's fun because I don't really care if they sell or not. It's not gonna make or break me, you know, and it's just that much better when they do sell. But I don't have to rely on it. And the other thing I'd say about what Seth said about just luck, almost my whole career came from two things. One, going up to Livingston, Montana when I was a junior in college and asking a publisher for an internship, a summer internship, and then a year later asking Rapid City Journal for a free internship for 3 months. You know, it was so competitive to get a job back in those days, and it's even worse now, that I said, I will work for 3 months for you guys for free. Just, I don't have any experience because I can't get a job, and I can't get a job because I don't have any experience. And thus is my dilemma. And at that time, the publisher said, cool, we'll take you on. And it changed my whole life. I shot for Los Angeles Times and Denver Post and Washington Post and USA Today and Newsweek, and just had an amazing career in the 90s before the internet and everybody was a photographer all of a sudden. And I worked for the Associated Press and Pier, and Miles City Star was my first job up in eastern Montana. But it all came from just luck stuff and meeting the right people at the right time. And not being lazy. I worked around the clock 7 days a week when I was an intern, and lived in my back of my truck in the Badlands or Pine Ridge or whatever it was, trying to get some awesome photos in the paper while I had a chance. And it got me a job there afterwards for almost 7 years. So that's what I.
Well, that's what I asked.
Question.
Yeah. I asked for advice, and you gave your best advice. The book, Surviving the 72 Flood, is for sale. Oh, Bill has a question.
Well, I do have one question for the guys, with Pat Roosevelt sitting here and everything. Has anybody ever, you know, the city is just so immensely different, not just in the way it looks, but really its whole character, because it was sort of a sleepy little cabin, you know, motel cabin town and everything before the flood, and then instantly changed. Has anybody ever tried to put together a collection of like I really enjoy those, you know, exploring with Custer type things, where you see then and now and everything. Having a book that maybe showed Rapid City in 1950 and all these areas that used to be residential, like right across the street here. Triplets Cafe, remember that one, Darla?
Yes.
I mean, it's just completely a different city, and then right at the flood and what it's turned into, I think that'd be a fascinating city. Does anyone try it?
Bill wants to know if anybody did any photography that would relate to the way it was a cabin town as to what it is now, now and then kind of shots. But I might have just something to say about this whole thing, because everybody wonders where all the pictures of the floods are, or the flood is. We didn't all have cameras on us all the time back then, right? You know, I mean, now there would have been thousands of them. That, you know, and at that time there were maybe a few hundred. And it was so different. We just didn't have cameras. I didn't think of going out and taking pictures of the floating houses or anything. My parents certainly didn't want to have that picture in their mind. So a lot of us just didn't take pictures.
Well, one of the guys we wanted to interview for the story was Don Polovich, whom probably all of you know. I mean, he has by himself taken hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of flood photos for the Journal back in those days, but he wasn't in great health when we tried to track him down. But it was kind of funny, that question, because somebody just was emailing me about 3 or 4 days ago. They're asking all about the book. I'm trying to tell him, and he finally goes, well, what I was wanting was pictures of how Rapid City looked before the flood and how it looked after the flood. I'm like, well, that's not what we did. But part of the reason, Paul, you're right, Paul Horsted's the guy to do that, if anybody is, and Minnelusa has collections too. But what I see as the problem with that is Minnelusa has photos of Rapid City in 1880 and 1890 and 1900, and then you got the 20s, 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. How do you, Rapid has changed a lot more than just because of the flood, you know.
Yeah.
We're talking about restaurants that were livery stables and lakes that were in the gap here, and just crazy stuff that I wouldn't even know where to begin. I mean, Rapid in 1950 or Rapid in 1940 or what? You know, it'd be a pretty daunting project, I think. That was my answer.
Well, we do have to wrap it up. We are kind of out of time here. We do have the books for sale from this particular session. Back there with Steve Thorpe, we have Steve's book from the last session is also back there tonight for sale. Please hang out. If you like this sort of thing, I'd like to get your email so we can let you know when our next one will be, just to remind you of when it's coming up. These are free. I forgot to thank one of our sponsors at the very beginning of the evening, the South Dakota Arts Council, who is having their conference here in town this weekend. So thank you to all of our sponsors. Thank you to the people that came here tonight, and especially to these fine writers and photographers that took time to really, I get kind of choked up at this. You probably saw me a couple times, but to take a great journalistic approach to looking at the flood and remembering those sometimes horrific stories, just so that we don't take advantage of Mother Nature again. And thank you all for coming here tonight. See you at the next Writer's Block.
Thank you. Just for the record, they're not all sad and tragic stories. One is about a ring that was returned to a lady that she lost over by the fairgrounds in 40 years later. But somebody tracked her down at the local library by the date of her graduation and the initials on the ring, and gave her ring back. And she wears it every single day today, and she's super happy to have it back.